Good, good evening, everybody. Hello. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Jim Anaya, and I'm the Dean of the Colorado Law School. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this 9th annual John H. and Cynthia H. Schultz lecture on energy. As many or most of you know, I just started as dean here a couple of months ago. And one of the things that attracted me to this law school, was its world-class programming on natural resources, energy, and the environment. And this programming is centered in the Getches-Wilkinson Center, which is one of the university's premier research and public policy institutions. I'd like to acknowledge Alice Madden, there she is right here, who is the executive director of the center, who just started a couple of weeks before I did here, so she can claim seniority on me in some way. The Schultz lecture is one of our most important endowed lectures, and we're continuing our streak of getting truly exceptional speakers to give the lecture. Last year, Governor Hickenlooper gave the lecture. In the past, we've had Senator Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico, Jim Rogers, the former CEO of Duke Energy, and Daniel Yergin. And this year, we're very pleased to have one of the world's preeminent energy economists, Paul Joskow from MIT and the Sloan Foundation. He's here to talk about climate change and the electric power sector. Welcome, Paul. I still have a little more to say. And, I'm just introducing the introducer, actually. Professor William Boyd will give a more formal introduction in just a moment. I want to say that we're extremely grateful to John Schultz from the Colorado Law Class of 1953 for endowing this important and impactful lecture series. Unfortunately, John is not feeling well and is unable to join us, but he sends us regrets, and we, of course, wish him well. However, his daughter, Cynthia Howard, is here with her husband, Dave. Welcome. And their two children, Elisa and Michael. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for coming. And Michael, I should note, has continued the Colorado law tradition. He's a graduate of the class of 2014. In addition to endowing this lecture, John Schultz has made substantial gifts in support of our loan repayment assistance program, gifts for student scholarships, and a faculty fellowship, which is held by our William Boyd, the John H. Schultz Energy Law Fellowship. He's really a wonderful man whom I've gotten to know a little bit since coming to Colorado. His generosity and warmth is really, truly renowned among those who know him. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us this evening, and I will now turn it over to William Boyd to introduce our speaker.
We like introductions here. Thank you, Jim, and let me just say how excited we are here at Colorado Law that you have taken the helm as Dean. It's wonderful to have you, so thank you so much and welcome. I also want to thank John Schultz and the entire Schultz family for your generous support of this lecture and the law school. I'm very sorry that John cannot be here with us tonight. The Schultz lecture has always been one of the highlights of the year for me and for so many of us working on energy here at the law school and beyond, and I am deeply honored to be the inaugural John H. Schultz Energy Law Fellow here. John and his family have done so much for this law school, and especially for our students, so thank you. I also want to thank and welcome Alice Madden, the new Executive Director of our Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment. Alice is amazing and needs no introduction in Colorado or anywhere else. She started about the same time as Jim said earlier this summer, and all I can say is that the gods were smiling on us when they sent Jim and Alice our way. I want to thank Sean LaBar, standing there in the back, our program manager at the Getches-Wilkinson Center. He puts these events together and keeps us all on track, and he's really been holding the center together over the last several years, so thank you, Sean. I know we have several members of the Getches-Wilkinson Center Advisory Council here, including Ann Getches, and a number of our faculty from the program, including Charles Wilkinson. Thank you all for being here and for your ongoing support of the center. I want to thank our partners at the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, and particularly the director, Bob McGrath, who's here with us tonight. And I want to thank our students and our colleagues from across campus and our friends from the community for being here tonight, what will surely be a very interesting and important topic. I finally want to thank our former dean, Phil Weiser, who was the one who invited Paul Joskow to deliver this lecture. Phil sends his regards from Sydney, Australia. He went as far away as possible from Boulder to take his sabbatical, well-deserved sabbatical, but we're looking forward to having him back here at Colorado Law in the spring. And while we're on the topic of Australia, I just want to mention that we have a visiting scholar here with us for the next few weeks, Rosemary Lister from the University of Sydney. She will be talking here in this room on Monday, the 26th, next Monday, this coming Monday at 5:30 on climate justice and disaster law. Please join us for that. We will end the lecture promptly at 6:30 for those who want to watch the first presidential debate. It starts at 7 p.m. I can't imagine why anyone would want to watch that debate, but we will end promptly at 6:30 in case you do. We are incredibly fortunate to have Paul Joskow here with us tonight to deliver the 9th annual Schultz Lecture. Professor Joskow is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in New York and the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics Emeritus at MIT. After receiving his PhD in economics from Yale, he joined the economics faculty at MIT in 1972 and was an active member of that faculty until 2010. It sounds like he plans to go back to that faculty when he finishes his tenure at the Sloan Foundation. His teaching and research have been in the areas of industrial organization, energy and environmental economics, competition policy, and government regulation of industry. He has published 6 books and more than 125 articles and papers and does not show any signs of slowing down. His work on the electricity sector in particular has had a huge influence in the United States and around the world. And like many of my colleagues in the legal academy who work in this area, I have learned a tremendous amount reading his work over the years. He knows public utility regulation, which was the subject of his doctoral dissertation and a topic that he has written on for many years, better than anyone. His 1983 book, Markets for Power and Analysis of Electricity Deregulation, co-authored with his colleague Richard Schmalenzi, preceded electricity restructuring efforts in the United States by more than 10 years, and is still the best single work available on the challenges involved in such an effort. The book cautioned his fellow economists, lawyers, and policymakers to proceed with care in any deregulation effort, to recognize the unique challenges involved with the electric power system, and to avoid the trap of looking casually to other sectors and other experiences with deregulation for lessons for the power sector. I think it's fair to say that the words of caution that he offered in that 1983 book have been vindicated in the wake of the challenges, the ongoing challenges of restructuring, and I dare say that if more people had taken them to heart in the early days of restructuring, we may have ended up with a better outcome. In any event, tonight, Professor Joskow will talk about another set of challenges facing the electric power sector, the effort to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity system in order to hit ambitious decarbonization targets by mid-century. This is surely one of the great challenges of our time, and there is no one better to help us understand the scale and scope of that challenge than Paul Joskow. After the lecture, we will have some time for Q&A, and I will moderate that. And as is our custom, we will take the first question from a student, so be thinking about questions because I see some familiar faces out there, and we will call on you if you don't raise your hand. So please join me in welcoming Paul Joskow.
Good afternoon or good evening, my time. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Schultz Howard family for being here and for inviting me here. As Bill said, Phil invited me, I think about a year and a half ago to come and give this lecture, and then I got an email from him telling me he wasn't going to be here. So I'm going to come anyway. So let me start by saying a couple of general things that have nothing in particular to do with the energy. First, just a little bit about me and how I approach problems in microeconomics. I believe that markets are very powerful mechanisms for allocating resources efficiently, not necessarily always fairly. But I also believe that markets can be imperfect, sometimes very imperfect, and that opportunities for regulation may improve the performance of markets. However, regulation is also imperfect. It's imperfect for technical reasons. Sometimes it's just hard to do. It's also imperfect for political reasons. As in many other areas of government, money talks. Interest groups play a large role in many regulatory agencies. And in my view, and the way I've approached many of the problems I've worked on in economics, is that there's kind of a trade-off between imperfect markets and imperfect regulation. And people will come to different conclusions about where that trade-off lies exactly, but I think it's important to recognize that markets can be imperfect, regulation can be imperfect. Sometimes we have to mix the two, but sometimes we have to make judgments about what's the best that we can do in an imperfect world. And that's the way I approach these problems. As Bill said, I've been studying the electric power industry, other regulated industries, energy and climate change for many years. I think you'll all agree that one of the biggest challenge, I know it's fashionable to say the biggest challenge facing our country is dealing with climate change. And there are lots of challenges facing the country. Let's just say climate change is a big problem. It's a global problem, but the U.S. has to be a world leader in this area, both because of our position in the world, but also because we have contributed so much to the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. The Obama administration and the leaders of many other countries have established very ambitious goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in their respective countries. In the U.S., it's something like an 80% reduction by 2050 and ultimately going to a zero net carbon world not to stop the continued warming, but to control the continued warming and to stabilize it at something between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. I know there are lots of smart people here, and you have different views on how we should do that and whether we should do that. I'm going to give you my views. We're going to have time at the end. You can yell at me. I'm used to it. And I hope we can have a good discussion at the end. Why electricity? Well, I know a lot about electricity. I have this old-fashioned belief that you should talk about things you know about. Second of all, the electricity sector is a major contributor to the production of greenhouse gases, about 30% of U.S. production and over 35% of CO2 emissions. And then third, I think properly, the electric power sector appears to be the sector, if we think of there being three general sectors, electricity, transportation, businesses, and residential uses, where we have technologies and opportunities to achieve significant reductions in CO2 emissions relatively quickly and potentially at relatively low cost. And so I think it's an important industry to focus on for all of those reasons. Most of the coal that we consume in the U.S. is consumed in the electric power industry, and coal is a major contributor to CO2 emissions. Despite the rhetoric that we hear from President Obama, which I think is very honest, the mayors of New York, the governor of California, about a commitment to reducing CO2 emissions, we do not have a comprehensive national policy to do this. And this is because Congress has not embraced the reality of climate change and has not adopted what I consider to be a well-designed set of policies to achieve a definitive goal to reducing CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions more generally. Instead, we have a hodgepodge of federal and state technology-specific mandates and subsidies that, in my view, are too often built on pork barrel politics, and in one important case, what I would consider to be, or some would consider to be luck. So we clearly have an imperfect regulatory world that has been designed on the one hand with people having a goal of reducing CO2 emissions, on the other hand with other people going along because it's kind of convenient to have more windmills in your state or ethanol subsidies or whatever they might be. In my view, that this can't go on, that the hodgepodge of policies we have, absent a clear national commitment to achieving significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and a set of national policies that are coordinated with the states, are going to make it very, very difficult for us to achieve these goals. So I'm going to tell you what's going on now in the electric power industry, where I see it's going, but my story is kind of pessimistic. I don't think we're going to meet 80% reductions by 2050. I'm going to explain the reasons for that. And maybe we'll meet the goals for 2020 and 2025, maybe even 2030, but those might be kind of dead ends, and there really is a major challenge to meeting these goals that I think can't be accommodated very easily without some fundamental changes in policy. So I'll start by talking about the electric power sector, and I'll come back at the end to talk generally what I view as policy reforms, both for electricity but also for the energy sector more generally. So let me start with where have we been and where are we now? This is just a pie chart of the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions, all greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity, as I said before, is about 30%. It's actually slightly less now for reasons that I'll discuss. This is from 2014. Carbon dioxide in the U.S. is the major contributor to greenhouse gases, although there are some controversies over the numbers for methane, which we can also discuss. This isn't true everywhere in the world. This tends to be the way developed countries look. In developing countries, greenhouse gases like methane, naturally occurring methane, are much more important, and CO2, in part because energy is not used nearly as much in those countries, is a less significant but still significant contributor. And then the electric power sector, as I said, contributes over 35%. In 2014, it was 38% of the carbon dioxide emissions, and is a natural target for those interested in controlling those emissions. This is a time series of emissions of carbon dioxide from the electric power sector. And what you can see from this is this goes back to 1990. Whoops. That's my own clicker here. Goes back to 1990, it then rises to 2005, and then it falls. And it looks 2016, we have data through March. It looks like it's continued to fall this year. And the major sources of reduction are reduction in CO2 emissions from coal, and what here appears to be increasing CO2 emissions from natural gas, not by as much, but that's because natural gas use has grown significantly in the electric power sector. And of course, the expansion of renewable energy, in particular, the significant expansion so far of wind generation. And I want you to keep in mind this year 2005. You will notice in all speeches given by the administration, our CO2 reduction goals are all based on 2005 emissions. I'm sure it's just an accident, but when I started in this game, it was supposed to be 1990. Different countries appear to pick their benchmark based on the year when CO2 emissions were the highest. And as we think about when the Paris Accords were signed, we were already halfway towards the commitments we made based on things that have happened, many of which were associated not with specific policies, but with the market. And here is just the other side of this. You see the very significant increase in the use of natural gas in electricity generation, and the very large decrease in the use of coal. And just approximately, as many of you know, natural gas produces 1 ton of CO2 for every 2 tons of CO2 produced by coal. That's not exactly right, but it's a good approximation. So one big change has been the increased use of natural gas, and it's been primarily market forces, and I want to come back to that. Then the question is, where does the natural gas come from, and what role does it play in the future? And then the increased role of renewable energy, and the increase has come almost entirely from wind, primarily, and increasingly now from solar energy. The biggest source of non-CO2 generating capacity is nuclear energy, actually. And the second largest is conventional hydroelectric energy, big dams, high dams, and neither of those is expanding. And I'll come back to that as well. If we decompose renewables, as you'll see, hydroelectric is very important. Wood, biofuels, biomass are also large. But if you look going forward, as we'll see, the big increases are wind and solar. And right now, they don't account for very much, despite all of the talk in our overall energy mix. And we are banking a lot on dramatic increases in those resources. Here's just another picture. You can see the increased use of natural gas and electricity, and the dramatic decline in coal use. Coal is still, of the fossil fuels, is still by far the major contributor to CO2 emissions in the electric power sector today, and obviously a major target of opportunity because of its high CO2 content. This is just my fun. I always go back to 1990, and if you look at 1990, which is what everyone used to use when the Kyoto Agreement was signed, we're about at 1990 levels, and the big reduction is based on peak year. We're not the only ones who do this. So here's Germany. So the Germans, not surprisingly, they use 1990. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about European history, 1990 was the year that East and West Germany came together. And over the course of at least the next decade, they basically closed down every power plant and every factory in Eastern Germany that had existed during the communist era. And that was a source of major reductions in CO2 emissions. That wasn't why they did it. They did it because these facilities were uneconomical. They produced horrible toxic chemicals and conventional air pollutants. But if you look at Germany, despite all the talk of the big energy switch, their greenhouse gas emissions have been constant since 2008. And that's kind of a puzzle as to what's going on there with all of the expenditures on wind and solar energy. They're not making all that much progress. And you see their target is still, when they go out to 2030 and 2020, it's not 2005, it's not 2015, it's 1990. And so there's some gaming going on in these targets as well. So where are we going? Well, there are lots of models out there that forecast the future of energy consumption and CO2 emissions in the electric power sector. I'm going to use the model that is used by the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, the NEMS model. It projects only out to 2040, unfortunately, for reasons I'll discuss. Why am I using that model? I understand it. And I understand its strengths, I understand its weaknesses. I know what happens when they put chewing gum in the model to make it some of the results come out more favorably. And it's kind of a, for those, I don't know if there are any, it's kind of a supply and demand model that links the demand and supply of all the different sectors together, and then makes assumptions going forward about things like future prices for oil and natural gas and GDP growth and population growth and so on. And what you can see from this, looking out to 2040, is that the mix of total energy sources in the U.S., this is total energy, not the electricity sector yet, is 33% natural gas, 14% renewables. There are people talking about 100% renewables. Well, by 2050. A lot's going to have to happen between 2040 and 2050 for that to be the case. Petroleum is still heavily used, not in the electric power sector, but in the transportation sector. Nuclear power, they assume, will continue to produce straight out forever from the current fleet of reactors. And coal, while it declines, is still a significant contributor. The CPP is the Clean Power Plan that is on hold at the present time, and it was a plan that was proposed by the Obama administration, by the EPA. One of the things that always kind of surprises me, and the EIA now does simulations up in the air, is, in the big picture, difference. I think it establishes some principles that are important, but it really doesn't make all that much of a difference. Now, 2040, we are still burning a lot of fossil fuels. We're producing a lot of CO2, and 2050 is only 10 years after 2040. And I'm going to discuss some barriers to really dramatically changing that picture by 2050 if we wait to 2040 to do it. Okay, as you all know, all these projections have uncertainties. I just want to give you a sense for some of the uncertainties. This is something you should always keep in mind when you look at forecasts of anything. They depend on assumptions about all kinds of micro and macroeconomic variables if they're economic assumptions, and if they're broader and they make assumptions about technologies, about technological change, about learning by doing, about the placement of facilities and how efficiently they can run. This is just a sense for how uncertain these are, and it's about a 20% difference by 2040. It depends on policy. So extended policies in the EIA's language means some of the policies that are scheduled to expire, they assume continue. They're supposed to do their reference case with current policies. They don't always do that, but that's what they're supposed to do. But even with extended policies, we're still producing in 2040 4.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. And while that's lower than what we're producing today, it's not all that much lower. It's about 20% lower. It's a lot lower than 2005, but we're already in 2015. And as we'll see, we've benefited tremendously from cheap natural gas during that period of time. This is just takes us to the electric power sector. Again, still significant amount of coal, natural gas, but renewables grow, but they don't grow to what some people say is we're going to be 100% renewables or 80% renewables by 2050. We're nowhere close to that by 2040. And again, you've got to think hard about what's going to change between 2040 and 2050, given the gradients of those curves. So let me turn to what things we're doing to try to reduce CO2 emissions from the electric power sector. And some of these we're doing in other sectors as well. So one is improving energy efficiency to reduce the rate of growth of demand for electricity. Now, for the last 10 years, well, since 2008, electricity demand has basically grown at essentially zero across the country. Now, some of that is due to the deep recession, but as I'll show you, there has been a continuing improvement in the energy efficiency of the U.S. economy, but there's lots of rhetoric about how energy efficiency is the cheapest way to reduce CO2 emissions by reducing electricity consumption. Not only that, but it's a free lunch, that the benefits are greater than the costs. And if only consumers realize this, they would be out there investing in energy efficiency and reducing their energy consumption without the help of government. This is known in the economics profession as the energy efficiency paradox. How could it be that people are leaving all these free lunches on the table, especially given all the discussion of them? And there are lots of barriers people talk about. Consumers are myopic. Another way of saying that, if you're an economist, is they use high implicit discount rates. They face capital constraints, so they can't afford to spend $25,000 or $30,000 on rehabbing their homes and putting in new windows and insulating their walls and all of that. They don't get it. They don't have the information. It's not disseminated very well. They're what are called principal agent problems. That renters and owners of buildings don't have the same incentives, and the builders don't make energy efficiency investments because they don't think that'll help them to increase their rents to cover the costs. So one of the things I've done at the Sloan Foundation, because this is a subject that is of great interest to economists, not just with regard to energy efficiency, but decisions more generally. It's a field called behavioral economics to try to understand why consumers don't appear to make what in conventional economic models would be rational decisions, that if something costs less than you get for it, you ought to do it. And so we have funded a growing number of what I consider to be well-designed randomized controlled trials, the kinds of things that are used in clinical medicine to test new drugs. These are not easy to do, but basically what you do is you pick two sets of, let's say, homes that are maybe candidates for weatherization. They're matched in terms of their sizes and the characteristics of their residents. And then one gets a treatment, some kind of energy efficiency program, and one doesn't. And then what you look at is what kind of take-up do you get from the energy efficiency program? How do the costs of installing the energy efficiency options in reality compare with the estimates that are made? How do the savings compare? And what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of consumer behavior is keeping them from taking the advantage of this? So I'm sad to say, and this is controversial, that many of these studies have found the costs are higher in reality than what a lot of the engineering models used by the people who come and audit your home use. The savings are less, and in particular, they tend to dissipate over time for certain kinds of investments. Consumers just don't want to do it. One of the randomized controlled trials to try to eliminate all the other things, not only did you get a free audit, you got free weatherization. So it was free. There was no upfront cost whatsoever. You didn't have to discount anything. All you had to do was let the people into your home to do the retrofits. And these people had to come back to us for another grant because they didn't have a large enough sample of people who would do it. And then when they got a larger sample and they had a large enough group of people who would do it, even though it was free, they found the costs were much higher than the estimates from the auditors. The savings were somewhat lower, and that maybe the consumers weren't irrational at all because the implied cost of every ton of CO2 removed was like $250, which is a very high number. And we've now funded, we have a consortium doing these studies, sometimes in conjunction with utilities because they're expensive and we need the data. But they're kind of discouraging, I would say, on both the cost front, the savings front, and the consumer behavior front. So we're spending a lot more money. We'll see if we get greater energy efficiency, but I think the evidence is that it's not going to save the day. So this is just a big ramp up. Regulatory agencies are asking utilities to spend more money. This is typically free audits, subsidies for energy efficient equipment, subsidies for weatherization. They're now moving into the commercial and industrial sectors where you would think they wouldn't have those behavioral problems, but that's the trend because the view is that this is really the cheapest way to reduce CO2 emissions. And another reason to think it may be a good way to do it is your old distribution network is changing. People in a number of states now have real-time meters. They have meters that can be controlled remotely. You can turn your air conditioner on and off from your iPhone. You can turn your lights on and off. You don't have to leave your air conditioning on when you're out during the day because you can flip it on 10 minutes before you come to your house. There's much better data on how you use the equipment. You can put sensors on major appliance users like refrigerators and air conditioners. and there are increased opportunities for this for the data that are being provided and the controls that are being provided to make energy efficient more effective. And this is just a picture in the middle. This is your old kilowatt hour meter. That's a Nest meter that is controllable via the internet. That's a real-time meter that can be controlled by the utility, can turn things on and off, and you can hook these up in your house with through your internal wireless connection to particular appliances and control those. So the opportunities seem to be greater. The question is, are they going to be realized? Well, here's another time series of, this is the primary energy consumption per dollar of GDP. And what I thought I'd find in looking at the projections was a bend in the curve. We're going to spend a lot more money. If you go back, actually, you can go back much further than this, and the energy consumption per dollar GDP has been declining forever, and you see some times when it didn't, right before the oil shock. If you have a really close eye, you can see, if you have a really close eye, you can see energy prices sort of collapsed in 1985, and people stopped conserving as much, and they went up again, they started conserving more. But I'm not seeing any significant effect in our projections of energy efficiency. And we either have to refine the projections or we really have to get our hands on what's going on here. Now, this isn't true about carbon intensity, though. If you can see here, carbon intensity and energy intensity per dollar of GDP basically just tracked each other all the way to 2005. And then we see a disconnect. You actually see a bend in the carbon dioxide curve. And that bend is due to a combination of using more natural gas, using renewables more, and continuing to generate nuclear energy at very high capacity factors. But we're not seeing the bend in the curve in energy efficiency. So I'm still a skeptic that energy efficiency is going to save the day. I'm a little concerned that we're maybe spending too much money on it and counting on it too much. I recently edited a symposium of papers, and one of the papers was from the EU and from some economists at the EU, and they went through the commitments of all the EU countries, and they rated them by various measures of their credibility, and 86% had at least one major flaw in the credibility of their estimates. And if we're making these numbers up, we ought to know now and not in 2040. It's going to be too late. So I think this is something where I know that the politically incorrect thing to say is that this just isn't as big a bonanza so far as people seem to think. Maybe it could be a bonanza, but we're going to have to work a whole lot harder on it. I won't go through that. Okay, so looking forward, the EIA has natural gas and renewables being the major contributors to reductions in CO2 emissions. Nuclear power just kind of hangs in there because we're only building 4 new nuclear plants now, 2 in Georgia and 2 in South Carolina. They're ridiculously expensive and they're way over, not only over budget, but they're late. It's deja vu all over again for nuclear power. So you've got to believe in natural gas, you've got to believe in renewables, and you've got to believe that nuclear power is still going to be there in 2050. And those are the 3 things that I want to look at now. So natural gas consumption increases in the electric power sector, according to these forecasts. It drives out coal. It increases in other sectors as well, especially in the industrial sector. Cheap natural gas is very good for American industries, especially petrochemicals and some others. But in the electric power sector, it really plays the role of quickly redispatching the system so that coal is used less often. If it's used less often, they can't cover their fixed costs, and the plants close. So it's kind of a big deal. But where does the gas come from? The gas comes from shale and tight oil plays. I've heard there are people in this state who don't like fracking. That's true in New York and Massachusetts, too. Massachusetts has no shale gas, but if they did, they'd be against it. New York has a ban against fracking. Well, fracking, there are a whole lot of issues with fracking. Environmental issues, community issues. There are issues in general of using more natural gas in terms of methane leaks. But if you don't like fracking, then you don't like natural gas, and you're taking one of the options that we're relying on off of the table. And I think it's something you need to recognize and ask the question, are there environmentally friendly ways to use this resource because it's abundant and economical? And are there ways of reducing methane leaks, especially on the production sites? I think the answer to both these questions is yes, but it's controversial, and it requires policy changes. But just keep in mind, when you're saying I don't want fracking, you're saying I don't want natural gas, and I don't want one of the major contributors to reducing CO2 emissions in the electric power sector. Okay, here's their forecast of renewables, and here I think they did put a little chewing gum on the model. So they have as you can see, wind grows until about 2020, and then it's flat. I think that may be a model feature. Solar grows through this entire period and actually overtakes wind by 2040. And this is both grid-based solar and it's rooftop solar, not only on residences but on commercial buildings as well. You see conventional hydro, which is zero carbon emissions, that's just flat. We're not building any more Hoover dams. The action here is all with wind and solar, and increasingly with solar. So you've got to really believe in those resources, because especially if you don't like natural gas, we don't have that many alternatives left. But these resources face some challenges, and I think we should recognize them. So it's not equally windy everywhere. There's a lot of wind in the middle of the country. There's a lot of wind offshore, and actually the East Coast is particularly attractive theoretically for wind generation. It's windy, constant wind. It's shallow, so that reduces the expense. It's near population centers, so it deals with transmission costs much more easily. But the problem here is the wind is here, and there's wind in West Texas, but the people aren't there. And there's been a big growth in wind in the middle of the country, and it wants to go east and displace fossil fuels. But it can't go east. It's stopped up because of transmission constraints. And they drew in here transmission lines. That really doesn't tell you anything about transmission constraints. Those are just lines. What I look at is congestion. And the way you measure congestion now on a restructured wholesale market is you look at the differences in spot prices at different locations. And in a market, if there's no transportation cost, and that's what transmission is, the prices should be the same everywhere. For natural gas, where transportation costs are very low, the spot prices are really very, very similar across the Midwest and the East and the South, aside from some pockets in Pennsylvania. But that's not true for electricity. You have many hours when the system is congested. This is just I just picked a particular day in July that had was very hot, and you can see you have very high prices in the east, and then you have prices in western Illinois, and at the interface between the PJM independent system operator and Midwest independent system operator, where prices are very, very low. And the wind may have been blowing that day, but it wasn't going anywhere except staying in the Midwest. So if we want to rely on onshore resources in the most attractive places, we have to worry about transmission. And it's not that transmission's expensive. Transmission isn't expensive. Nobody wants it. Nobody wants transmission lines running near where they live or work. There may be aesthetic reasons. There are people concerned about the health effects of electromagnetic frequency, radiation, and so on. But the fact of the matter is it's very hard to build major transmission lines. And until then, the best resources in the Midwest, in Iowa, you see wind generators with 45% capacity factors. And those are terrific. upstate New York, where the wind is also stuck and can't come into New York City because there isn't an adequate transmission, they get more like 27, 28% capacity factors. With an unconstrained system, we'd put even more wind in the Midwest and moving it east, but as a practical matter, that hasn't been possible. I'll skip that. Another barrier is intermittency. The wind doesn't blow constantly everywhere. And this is just a picture. The ERCOT is the Texas interconnection, covers most of Texas, not the far western part of Texas. And this is the amount of wind generation, daily wind generation, over the course of this year. I think the last date I used was August 31st. And you can see the variance is just enormous. And that's because the wind isn't constant. Sometimes it really blows, and sometimes it doesn't blow, but electricity demand doesn't look like that. So something has to fill in the gaps, and that's continued reliance on fossil generation. Maybe solar can be compatible with this. I'll come back to that. But at least in Texas so far, there's a lot of wind and, surprisingly, very little solar. So what this is telling you is either we're going to have a world where we're going to have a lot of backup fossil generators, probably natural gas, or we need to find good storage technologies, which we don't yet have. And that's an agenda item I think we have to consider, and I want to talk a little bit more about storage later on. This is the equivalent. This is the supply share of wind. It varies from 5% to 40%. That's a big variation, and that means there are a lot of generators that are sitting there not running during the high wind periods. And ERCOT has a completely deregulated market, so they have to have prices that keep them in service because they may operate only a few hours a year. And this is one that particularly impresses me. This is the hottest week in Texas in the summer of 2015. And the red line is demand, and the blue line is wind generation. And you can see that they are highly negatively correlated. This means that on the peak day, for reasons I don't fully understand, the wind wasn't blowing during the day when it was hot. It was blowing at night. They needed a lot of fossil generation to meet demand during that period of time. And the value of the wind for meeting peak demand, absent storage, is actually fairly low. Let's turn to solar. So this is a picture of what's happened to the costs of solar generation of various kinds, utility scale, so-called grid-based solar, residential, small commercial, and so on. You see the costs have declined rather significantly. Now, you may be surprised. First of all, grid-based solar is the cheapest. There's an MIT study the Sloan Foundation helped to fund, and one of its big conclusions was grid-based solar is much cheaper than putting it on your roof as a general matter, but that the subsidy structure we've created is too favorable towards rooftop solar. Now, for those who follow these costs, you may say, well, these numbers are just ridiculous, from $7 to $4 a watt. It's much larger than that. Well, you shouldn't confuse what's happened to the cost of solar modules, the panels themselves, with the installed cost of a full system on your roof. The module costs have declined really dramatically, but what they call in the electric power sector the balance of plant, that is installing it, putting in the equipment for it, has declined, but not nearly as quickly. And this is still, especially for rooftop solar, this is an industry that's highly fragmented. You know, you got to call my plumber and my electrician and my handyman to help to put these things up. And that is a major barrier to having these costs decline significantly. Let's skip that. So if we look at, so solar also has this locational issue. When I was in second grade, I was kind of a wise guy, and I had a student teacher who was showing us how the Earth turned on a daily basis and how it moved around the sun. And I raised my hand and said, you know, if the Earth turned that way, the sun would rise in the west and set in the east. And so there's a lot of confusion about this. But basically, this is a measure of, indirect measure of, you can think of it as the availability of a solar resource to generate electricity. And not shockingly, since the Earth kind of is shaped like that, and it takes 365 days to go around the sun, there are some variations by latitude and also by season in how much solar energy you can get. So you see a lot of solar energy being installed in New Jersey. Well, the only reason it's in New Jersey is because, can this work? Whoops. Well, I don't know how to use that. The only reason it's in New Jersey is they had lavish subsidies for solar in New Jersey. And similarly, California actually is pretty good, but they also have a very aggressive policy. But Texas, where in West Texas there are significant potential solar resources, has not seen much solar installed. They hope to see it installed. So there's a combination here of natural suitability, which affects the number of hours that a piece of equipment can be used, the amount of electricity it can generate, its cost, and public policy. And public policies seem to be driven more by local politics than they are by where it's sunny. So solar energy, this is for California, and this is grid-based photovoltaic. It also is intermittent. Actually, it's surprisingly intermittent, and here you actually see not only day-to-day intermittency, but you see some seasonal variation. So you see you get a lot more solar in the summer than the winter. Well, why is that? Well, that's because of the way the Earth rotates around the sun. And this becomes a more significant challenge for storage if you're going to rely heavily on solar, because it's not just day-to-day or for a week. It may be season to season. And we have some storage technologies that do that, dams, but we're not building any more of them. So intermittency is a potential barrier for solar as well. And then even at the individual level, absent storage, there's not a perfect match between how electricity is used in the home and when the solar generators operate. In principle, you can affect where that demand is more increasingly, but also if we had economical storage, we could move it from the day to the evening when it could be used more effectively and replace fossil fuel generation during that period of time. And again, people can rely on batteries. They're expensive. To be able to get it to go through the night is potentially very expensive, and to get it to go for 2 or 3 days is very expensive. So again, storage is really a very important piece of this puzzle. Let me just go on here. Subsidies. So solar energy is the beneficiary in many states of the most lavish subsidies around. If there's an investment tax credit, states like Massachusetts have renewable energy credits, which are extremely valuable. There are state direct subsidies. There are renewable portfolio standards in Massachusetts. They favor solar in Massachusetts. Why? It would be better to have solar in Arizona, but that's the way we do business if we don't have a national policy. And you can see 2015, this big increase in contracts were signed for grid-based solar. Well, why is that? Because people thought that the investment tax credit was going to expire in December. And at the very end of December, they extended it for wind, for solar, but they're going to phase it out. And we have to be worried about building up an industry and depending on an extensive array of subsidies if those subsidies are not going to be sustained. Now, the hope, of course, is that costs will come down and that they will be self-sustaining. One of the problems I'll address is that may not happen. If it does happen, the subsidies may still not go away, even though the money should probably be spent on other things. Let me say another thing about subsidies. This is from a paper written by a group at the California Energy Institute at Berkeley that has looked at the income distributional aspects of various subsidy programs to encourage energy efficiency, to buy electric vehicles, and so on. And they're at the panel A. The income distribution effects are really not very attractive. Most of the money goes to people in the upper half of the income distribution. And it's not that surprising if you think about it. If there's a lot of subsidies going for rooftop solar, you got to have a roof, you got to have a house. If you don't, you can't take advantage of that. We let people run their meters backwards so their distribution contributions are reduced, and that then gets transferred to people who don't have solar. So I think there are some issues here that for the last 15 years, there's been an alliance between consumer advocates and environmental groups. That wasn't always the case in the 1970s. And if we don't take account of the income distributional attributes, I have some concern that alliance may fray going forward. And we have a welter of state policies, renewable portfolio standards that vary from place to place. You'll notice the South is rather missing from being too concerned about the environment. And I like to kid my friends in California. I said, it's really great. You're doing all these policies to reduce CO2 emissions, but that's making it possible for Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama to do nothing. And obviously, if we had a national program, that wouldn't be the case. Okay, let me turn to nuclear. So the last nuclear power plant that began operating was in 1992. Many of the current plants began operating in the early 70s. They were licensed with a 40-year life. Most of them have been able to get 20-year life extensions. Those life extensions run out by 2050. You don't see it in the EIA forecast, but between 2040 and 2050 or 2052, unless they're extended for another period, which I think is unlikely, that nuclear is going to go away. Well, that's a lot of CO2 that has to be replaced. And I'm just comparing it here with wind plus solar. It's on the same order of magnitude of what we're getting over all these years from wind and solar. So if the nuclear disappears, we have a bigger problem. If you don't like nuclear and you don't like gas, you take those two off the table. Those are two important contributors to reducing CO2 emissions. Now, I'm very pessimistic about nuclear. I think this curve is wrong. Nuclear power plants have already started closing for economic reasons. Cheap natural gas has been, I guess, a benefit in the sense it's displaced coal, but it's also led to very low wholesale market prices. And especially in places like western Illinois and upstate New York, wind generation, when it can't go anywhere, drives the price not to zero, to negative levels, because you still get the production tax credit if you produce almost 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So these plants are likely to close early, and this is going to face an increasing challenge. And then in the long run, I just don't think the current technology is going to be satisfactory. We now have 4 examples of so-called third-generation nuclear technology: Finland, France, and now 4 in the U.S. And the costs have just been off-site, and the delays have been fantastic. The largest nuclear program is in China. We don't know, of course, they don't release their cost data or their planning data, but last time I looked, they were building 26 nuclear power plants. That may be where this technology evolves, but it also has to raise some concerns because there is no transparency about cost and safety and issues we can care about. Okay, before going to policy options, let me just conclude, since I should say something about restructuring, because you said so many nice things about the book that Dick Schmalensky and I wrote. So during the period of the second half of the 1990s, a restructuring revolution swept the country. And the restructuring was fairly simple. It was to end the vertically integrated regulated monopoly, at least to separate generation, to make it a competitive wholesale market, to unbundle the distribution function between retailing and actually physical distribution, and to have competition at both levels, leading only the wires to be regulated. Well, it turns out that it didn't go all that well, and the only states that have adopted what I would consider what I call the standard model for restructuring is Texas. The New England states and Illinois have reasonably good approximations, but most other states either have the old system or they have some hodgepodge of combinations of partial restructuring and continued regulation. So the question is, has the restructuring that's taken place and the implications in other states been good or bad for the environment? And I would argue it's been good for the environment. It's been good for getting new technologies on the supply side into the market more quickly than would have been the case if we relied on the local utility to invest in solar and wind. It's also allowed new technologies to experiment with, enter experimentally, which I think would have been very, very difficult. So I think it's been a positive for renewable energy, and the states have still figured out ways of forcing the distribution utilities or the competitive generators to keep renewable energy in their portfolios. Also, if you look across states, and increasingly retailers have more products to offer. For a long time, really the only product they could offer for residential customers, we'll buy our power from a renewable source, and that will increase the demand for it. And you see there's a significant difference between the retail choice states and the traditional states. But now with the smart grid, with smart meters, there are more products to offer, and you see that happening, especially in states like Texas, where the retailers are coming in, looking at the consumption patterns of the consumers and offering them options for how they can move some of their consumptions to periods when prices are lower, or how they can use their energy more efficiently. So one of the most popular programs in a number of states are air conditioner recycling programs. And the idea is a lot of people don't want to sit there and look at the real wholesale price of electricity every 10 seconds. But they will contract with a third party, and you can say, okay, you can cycle my air conditioner. That means it's on 30 minutes, it's off 30 minutes, on 20 hot days during the summer. And that saves a significant amount of energy. And there are options for doing that with your lights, with other things that wouldn't have been possible years ago. And retailers are very innovative because they want to attract customers. Okay, so let me turn now to how can we do better. Well, first of all, we need a clear national commitment to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The cat and mouse game between Congress and the executive, and from one administration to another, and from one state to another, can't possibly lead to an efficient policy. It's just not feasible if we're going to be serious about meeting these ambitious goals. Second, we need to establish a principle that we want to do this at the lowest possible cost, because someone is paying that cost. You can hide the cost with subsidies and mandates and putting it on the wires and all kinds of other things, but there's a lot of rhetoric about how this is going to be free and it's going to create green jobs. It's all baloney. It's going to cost money, and it's going to be worth paying the money if we do it right. But it's important that we not convince people that everything here is a free lunch, because when they discover it's not, there's going to be a backlash. Third, any comprehensive policy requires we place a significant price on CO2 emissions. And it could be a tax, it could be cap and trade. There are arguments for or against both of these, but putting a price on CO2 emissions is very, very important. It gets the short run and long run incentives right on every margin. It gives all supply and demand side technologies an equal opportunity to take advantage of reducing, either providing a low or no carbon supply or reducing consumption. And it does not get us stuck with subsidizing a specific set of technologies that in the long run may not deserve subsidies and may not be the best. And just to give you a sense, one of the concerns people have is the nuclear plants closing. Actually, the cost of, if you gave the existing nuclear plants the same production tax credit you give to wind, 2.5 cents, they'd all be economical. That's the magnitude. I also think we need to wean ourselves from the direct and indirect subsidies over time. It's hard to make them go away, but also that money ought to be spent on new technologies where we're really experimenting and we're trying to get them down the learning curve and see if they actually work. And if you don't believe these subsidies can stay around forever, think of the ethanol subsidy. The ethanol subsidy started as a protectionist sugar industry policy. Then it became a CO2 mitigation policy. Increasing use of methanol was predicated on the development of cheap cellulosic ethanol, which never happened. And may never happen. Maybe it will, but it hasn't happened yet. But we still have ethanol subsidies, even though the CO2 benefit is minimal at best. We need to worry about income distribution effects of different policies. I've talked to that. We need to dramatically expand our long-run R&D program in conjunction with other countries. This is not just a U.S. problem, of course. So what's high on my list? Storage is the highest thing on my list. And storage in all the dimensions that are relevant to these intermittency problems, not just moving electricity a few hours from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, but being able to store it for a day, for a week, for a month, maybe even some seasonal storage. I think we should be spending money on carbon capture and sequestration technologies. The experience so far is that they've been very expensive. But there are some sometimes wacky ideas people have, and I think they're worth exploring, and that means taking the CO2 either out of the flue gas of a generator or out of the atmosphere. I think we've got to spend money looking at next generation nuclear power. It's either an option or it's not an option. We ought to know that because it's going to be gone after 2050. If it's not an option, and that creates other challenges. And it's worth spending some money with other countries in looking at next generation nuclear technologies that meet several criteria. They've got to be reliable, they've got to be safe, inherently safe, and we're going to have to solve the waste disposal problem. All those go together. And I don't see that happening until after 2050, but we have to start spending money on that now. Materials and technologies. We need to continue to push forward the front on new materials that improve energy efficiency economically. And finally, we have to understand human behavior. This is not technology, it's not engineering, it's psychology, it's economics. We need to know, are these free lunches really free or not? If they're not free, if they are free, how do we get consumers to adopt them? If they aren't free, what kinds of adaptations can we make in materials to make them more economical? And I'll stop there. Sure.
Ever wondered why they called economics the dismal science? Maybe now we have some insight into that. But that was a wonderful, fact-filled lecture, and thank you so much, Professor Joskow, for that. And I'm glad you sort of ended on a slightly optimistic note in terms of the policies we could be thinking about going forward. So, as is our custom, and given that we have limited time and want to maximize the discussion here, I will take the first question from a student. And I know there's a mic available moving around. I see one all the way in the back there. I think that's John. I can barely see you there. Yeah. Here's a mic coming real quick, just so we can get it. I can hear. Yeah, but there's a webcast. So,
John, why don't you come? Can you get out of there?
No, I can't.
He'll never get out of there.
So you were talking a lot about storage technologies and that we mean to be looking into that. And when I think of that, besides like dams, obviously, I think of batteries a lot. Do you think that the environmental costs associated with the disposal of those batteries is worth the environmental costs that they save in terms of CO2 emissions?
Well, I think that's an important issue. I don't see lead-acid batteries as being the storage medium of choice. I don't know if you've ever seen, there are, I've visited data processing centers that use lead-acid batteries as backup, as well as emergency generators. But you'd have to fill your whole basement with lead-acid batteries to smooth out over time the activity. So I think they're too expensive, and as you say, the environmental costs of disposing of lead, and here, let me be clear about this. There are direct costs of actually disposing of it properly, but you've got to expect that some of this lead is going to leak out of the system, and it's a very toxic material. So I'd be looking at new materials, new technologies, new chemistries, and that's what the Department of Energy has an R&D program, a modest R&D program called RPE that looks at way out things. They would never put money into lead-acid batteries or lithium-ion batteries. They're looking for new battery technologies that are cheaper, longer lasting, and less toxic.
Sharon Jacobs over here.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the role you see for energy efficiency and demand-side management. I take you at your word that we're not seeing major effects in our carbon emissions from energy efficiency policies, but then later in the presentation you stressed the importance of energy management in flattening out demand curves or changing demand curves in a way that will boost the reductions we get from renewable resources. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, what
sure.
role you see.
So, demand-side management, as opposed to energy efficiency, was always just viewed as this an economical opportunity where you could reduce the need for peak generating capacity, for example. But because of enhanced control technologies and monitoring technologies, we can now use it also to more efficiently use the equipment that we have, whether it's cycling air conditioners or turning lights on and off in response to changes in prices, and we can actually reduce the use of electricity. But more importantly, it's a way of better matching some of these, especially rooftop solar, some of these intermittent technologies. So some of the action can be on the demand side, not just on the supply side, especially in the short run. So you can think about putting batteries in your basement to store electricity for until 11 o'clock at night, let's say. But wouldn't it be better if you could shift some of that demand into the hours when the solar is actually working? So I see some real opportunities there. Also with electric vehicles that can both charge and discharge potentially in a way that helps to smooth out demand. So I see the interaction between renewables and demand management as being very important. On energy efficiency, it's just kind of this puzzle. Amory Lovins will tell you everything costs 2 cents, and I like him, and he's charming, and so on. I've been to his house a million times, and I wouldn't want to live in his house, but he lives in his house. And but then you look at, there's something going on there. Human behavior, or the models for the costs are wrong, or people install the stuff and then open the windows, and you're losing some of the heat on hot days that you don't anticipate. I do know, I've seen in many of these studies a very simple flaw that anyone who's taken statistics would know. So you should never make a forecast of energy efficiency penetration by using the average consumer, because consumers have a distribution of consumption patterns. And I can tell you, I still have a house in Boston, but I only use it 60 days a month, let's say. The economics of putting in energy efficient light bulbs is dramatically different if I'm there the whole year from whether I'm there just for 60 days. So the proper way to model this is to have the whole distribution and then look at the part of the distribution where the savings are greater than the costs, and that's not going to be all of them. So there's an inherent overestimate in some of the modeling that just uses the quote typical consumer rather than the whole distribution. Sophisticated people don't do that, but others do. Then there's a problem that's now been documented. There are some standard models that energy auditors use to estimate what you can save and what the costs will be. And they've just repeatedly shown to be wrong. And I've read some of these papers. We funded some of the studies, and I keep saying, well, why don't they get a better model? One of the potential advantages of now having better data on home consumption from real-time meters is we can get a better sense for how consumers are responding to energy efficiency enhancements and understanding better how this differs from type of household to type of household. And I think this really is it's a behavioral economics question or a psychology question. Some of you know that a company that's now been bought, but O-Power was doing these experiments where they would compare you to your neighbors. So I was in one of these experiments, and my house in Brookline, Massachusetts was in it, and I always got 5 smiles. Well, I was only there 6 or 7 days a month, and my neighbor, who's also an MIT, he's a physicist, I'd always show him, I said, Patrick, how many smiles did you get? And it would drive him crazy. He said, you're only here 60 hours a year, and it's not fair. So they showed some small effects of that, but I think not as big as some people had thought. And you just got to keep doing these experiments we're doing and trying to learn how to make this work better, because so far it's just not working all that well.
So I think we have time for one.
But I should say something. I'm an economist. I'm supposed to be against standards. But actually, I think some of these standards are actually pretty good. So refrigerator standards are really good. Air conditioner standards are not so good if you can put in a second air conditioner when they give you a big subsidy. I think building code standards, if they're enforced, are pretty good for basic things. So I'm not an opponent of standards in general. I think they can be used intelligently as long as they're enforced properly, but you also have to recognize that there are some downsides to them as well.
We had a question here. I think we got time for 1 or 2 more, and then we'll go to the reception, but I'm sure Professor Joskow will be available to have conversation up here.
Thank you. You said that carbon price was a major policy priority. You didn't express a preference between cap and trade or a carbon tax. Do you have a preference, and if so, why?
So, okay.
This could take
First
a
of
while.
all, it could take a while, but I'll be short on this. First of all, I think economists, by arguing about this subject, should it be a tax or a cap and trade, they were arguing how many angels are on the head of a pin, and they gave fodder to people who didn't want to do either to say even the economists don't agree. I was in favor of cap and trade. I helped design the cap and trade system for CO2 emissions, which I think in 1990, which I think worked very well. The major reason I was in favor of it in that case was because I thought these tickets were a very good way of getting a political consensus. You could get a vote in Indiana, you get 50,000 allowances. And Georgia, you don't like it? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to give you 200,000 allowances. And it was really the politics of it that I thought was attractive, and that people didn't understand it was going to raise the price of electricity all that well. I think people have figured that out now. I think a global cap and trade system would be challenging. I'd be happy to do a tax system in the US now because I think it's simpler and has some other benefits in that it would raise a lot of revenue to start with, and that could help to some combination of expanding the federal budget and also reducing bad taxes. We view this as a good tax. I think the problem with a tax system in the US is a really good system has to match what other countries are doing. So you really want to be able to trade across countries because there are a whole lot of opportunities in India that they can't afford that are very low-cost ways of reducing CO2 emissions. We'd like to be able to trade our obligations back and forth, and that's easier to do with the cap and trade system, at least as we've designed them, than with the tax system. And to me now, that's really the question. Can we make a tax system harmonize with the cap and trade systems that are being done elsewhere?
Can I just add on to that and ask one more question, though? Do you
Sure.
think that a carbon tax is more politically viable today, say, than it was 5 or 10 years ago? I mean, is the sort of climate of opinion on this changing a bit at all?
Well, certainly the public is more concerned about climate change. I think it's really Congress Republicans, look, the real problem is the climate change deniers, primarily in the Republican Party. And they've held things up. If they would recognize that climate change is a serious problem, a whole lot of things would change. We'd start having better policies because Republicans have always been for market-based environmental policies, if you could. So I think a carbon tax would be more amenable to them than some of the array of mandates and subsidies we have. It's also something that could be part of a general tax reconciliation to restructure the federal tax system. So I'm more optimistic than I was a few years ago, but it really requires either the climate change deniers changing their mind or the rest of Congress having the courage to override them.
Mm-hmm. One more question, right here. If you could just introduce yourself and start screaming. Yes.
Nobody else has.
You don't have to.
I'm a graduate in the mechanical engineering program. Couldn't agree with you more about needing a national policy, but since we don't have one, a lot of communities are trying to do what they can, including Boulder. And we're trying to fire Xcel Energy. There's a pretty lively debate here about, that, better to try to do this on our own or try to make Xcel bend our will. And I'm just wondering.
I don't have any particular thoughts
Don't
on
answer
the
that
case,
question.
on the case here. But I will tell you, if you go back and look at the early environmental controversies in the early 70s over conventional pollutants, the biggest resistance came from entities like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So just because it's public, once it's a bureaucracy, doesn't mean it's going to operate any better than a regulated private company. And to get the regulated private companies, and I'll close with this, to do what you want, there's a CEO, utility CEO, I think very highly of him, the rat needs to smell the cheese. So if you tell them you'll pay for it, or their ratepayers will pay for it, and they'll get recovery of the cost, they'll do anything you want. I think rather than fighting the municipal battle, which has been fought for 100 years, largely unsuccessfully by the municipal utilities, I think it's better to focus on improving the regulatory system so that the incentives are properly aligned with the goals, the public policy goals that you have. And if the incentives are aligned, the private companies will follow the cheese, and they'll do what you want them to do. If you make it burdensome on them, if you tell them, we want you to sign long-term contracts for grid-based solar, but we're not going to allow you, we'll consider down the road whether you can recover the cost, well, they're going to be against it. You want to have an alignment, and that's where I would focus my attention.
And on that note, we have cheese and beer right over there, so let's thank Professor Joskow. Thank you all very much. That was excellent. Thank you so much. It was snow.